In 2015, the terrified look on this woman's face captured one of the final moments of her life. Within hours, she would be found brutally killed alongside her 2 sons and another young girl, making it one of the most heartbreaking cases in one of the safest countries in the world. And it happened less than 3 days before Christmas. It was so bad that people there dubbed the killer as the Beast of Rupperswil. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. To understand why this crime hit Switzerland so hard, you have to understand the place where it happened. Rupperswil is a small municipality, a village, really, in the canton of Aargau, roughly in the center of Switzerland. The Rupperswil neighborhood, where our story takes place, was considered especially calm. Mostly young families, children everywhere, very little crime to speak of. Carla Schauer-Freiberg was 48 years old. She was a mother, a partner, a presence in her community. By the accounts of everyone who knew her, she was warm, capable, and deeply devoted to her 2 sons. Her older son, Dion, was 19. Her younger son, Davin, had just turned 13. Carla's partner, Georg, whose last name was not publicly released, lived with the family. He worked regular hours and was, by all accounts, a stable, loving presence in their home. Neighbors who spoke to investigators after the murders described the couple as genuinely happy together. No known conflicts, no tension. Just an ordinary family living an ordinary life in a quiet Swiss village. And then there was Simona. She was 21 years old and had been dating Dion for some time. On the evening of December 20th, the night before everything fell apart, Simona made a spontaneous decision. Instead of going home, she decided to stay over, and that decision would cost her her life. Investigators would later note that Simona's presence in the house that morning was entirely unplanned. She had not told anyone she was staying. The man who came to that door the next morning had no way of knowing she would be there. She became, in the clinical language of the case file, an accidental victim. That phrase is hard to sit with, but we'll come back to it. When everything was finally pieced together, detectives built out a precise timeline to understand exactly what happened that day, minute by minute. It was a Monday, the week before Christmas. Georg got ready for work, said his goodbyes, and walked out the front door at approximately 7:30 a.m. But from less than 500 meters away, a 33-year-old man was watching him leave. He had been watching this family for months. He knew their schedule, when the house was full, when Georg left, what the mornings looked like. He had been preparing for this exact moment, and now that moment had arrived. A few minutes after 8:30, he walked up to Carla's front door and rang the bell. He was dressed neatly and carried a backpack. In his hands, he held a printed document and a business card identifying him as a school psychologist. The letter explained that Carla's younger son, Davin, had been accused of bullying a female classmate at school, and that as the assigned psychologist, he was required to conduct a formal interview with the boy that morning. Every single word of it was fabricated. He had designed the fake letter himself, printed the fake business cards himself, and spent weeks putting the whole deception together. And when Carla opened the door, she had absolutely no reason to be suspicious. He was calm, polite, and professional. He had documentation. He had an official-sounding explanation. Once inside and partway through a conversation with Davin, he reached into that backpack and pulled out a knife. What happened next is documented in court records and the perpetrator's own later confession, and I want to be thoughtful about how I tell this part, especially because Davin was 13 years old, in his own home, and was the specific reason this man had come to that door in the first place. He deserves to have this told with care. Using the knife as a threat against Davin, the intruder forced Carla to bind and gag everyone else in the house, Dion, Simona, and eventually Davin himself. Once he had full control, he gave Carla one instruction: go to the bank, withdraw cash, come back, and tell no one, or her children would not be alive when she returned. He told her he only wanted the money. He told her that if she cooperated, everyone would be fine. She believed him, because what mother in that situation wouldn't? She did exactly what he said. At 9:50 in the morning, a surveillance camera at a nearby ATM captured Carla making a withdrawal. However, the machine caused her trouble almost immediately. A technical glitch meant it could only dispense euros rather than Swiss francs, so she took what it gave her and kept moving. 20 minutes later, at 10:10 a.m., she walked into her bank and approached the counter, requesting a cash withdrawal in Swiss francs, the specific denomination he had demanded. Bank staff would later tell investigators that she seemed visibly on edge, tense, distracted, not quite present. Police later released a photograph taken during this visit, and if you look at it, you can see it clearly in her face, a woman carrying an enormous weight and trying desperately not to let it show. Between the ATM and the bank counter, she withdrew the equivalent of just over €1,000. Then she went back home and handed it over. What she could not have known, what she had absolutely no way of knowing, was that the moment she stepped back through that front door, she had already run out of time. Around the same time that Carla was standing at that bank counter, Carla's parents were making their way slowly through the streets of Rupperswil. They had driven in from a nearby town to visit their daughter for the holidays. They turned into the narrow street where Carla lived and noticed the smoke. At first, they assumed it was fireplace smoke drifting from somewhere nearby. It was December, and the smell had been in the air for a while. But as they got closer, the sky directly above their daughter's house was turning a heavy, dark black. This was not a neighbor's chimney. Carla's house was on fire. Emergency services had already been called by the time the couple arrived, and fire trucks and an ambulance came quickly. Within minutes, the firefighters had the blaze under control, but inside the house, they found 4 people, and none of them had survived. Carla's parents stood out on the street, not yet knowing what the firefighters had found. Her father called Georg. It was exactly 11:40 in the morning, and told him, according to the official record of that call, "There's a fire at your place. Come immediately." Georg arrived to find emergency vehicles, police tape, and a growing crowd of neighbors. He wasn't allowed anywhere near the property, and nobody was giving him any information. Officers eventually asked him to get into their patrol car, and it was only there, in the back seat, that they told him 4 bodies had been found inside the house. What followed was a long and brutal evening for Georg. He was questioned for hours, his hands were examined for traces of soot, his phone was confiscated, and he was taken to the police station. At some point during all of it, it became clear to him that he was being treated as a suspect, but Georg had an airtight alibi. He had been at work since early that morning, and his colleagues confirmed every detail. He was released just after midnight. The investigation was only hours old, and it was already hitting walls. The forensic situation investigators walked into was about as difficult as it gets. The fire had been deliberately set using a flammable liquid, most likely a commercial fire starter, poured across the bodies and throughout the house before ignition. The intent was obvious: destroy the evidence, compromise the crime scene, make identification as difficult as possible. The following day, the Forensic Institute confirmed the identities of all 4 victims: Carla, 48, Dion, 19, Davin, 13, and Simona, 21, who had only been in that house because she decided to stay over the night before. The cause of death for each of them was the same: deep wounds to the neck. The fire had been set after they were already gone. Police canvassed the entire neighborhood carefully, but not a single resident reported seeing anything suspicious, not in the days leading up to December 21st, not on the morning of the murders, and not a single person seen leaving the property afterward. No unfamiliar cars, no strangers on the street, nothing. When investigators interviewed everyone in the victim's immediate circle, friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, the same picture came back every time. Carla and Georg were happy together. No known conflicts, no debts, no falling outs with anyone. Nobody could offer a single reason why anyone would want to harm this family. By the end of the first week, 40 investigators were working the case 7 days a week, around the clock, and they had almost nothing to show for it. Police released photographs of Carla at the ATM and at the bank counter that morning, along with a public appeal asking whether anyone had seen her, noticed someone nearby, or watched her being driven to the bank. Nothing useful came back. Then, in February 2016, 2 full months after the murders, police held a press conference and made a major announcement. Despite the fire, forensic specialists had managed to recover DNA and fingerprints from the crime scene. The profile almost certainly belonged to the killer, and it pointed to a single perpetrator acting alone. But there was one serious problem. The profile didn't match anyone in any Swiss police database. They had the killer's DNA in their hands. They just had no idea whose it was. A reward of 100,000 Swiss francs was offered for information leading to an arrest, and the tips that came in were, almost without exception, completely useless. The case was in serious danger of going cold. This is the part of the case that I find genuinely remarkable, because what ultimately cracked it open wasn't a dramatic witness confession or a lucky forensic discovery. It was a theory, a data request, and one very telling gap in a phone record. Here's how investigators started thinking about it. This crime was far too well planned to be random. The fake business cards, the forged letter, the precise knowledge of Georg's schedule, the awareness of who was in the house and when, Whoever did this had done serious preparation, which meant he had very likely been physically watching the family for some time before December 21st. And if he'd been watching them in person, there was a reasonable chance he'd also looked them up online at some point. But before we get into that, I actually want to give a quick shout out to this comment from one of our videos, because that's how this case came to our attention. And if there's a case you think needs to be heard, don't be shy. Drop it in the comments below. Okay, back to the case. Investigators sent a formal request to Google, asking for the IP addresses of anyone who had searched for information connected to the victims in the weeks and months before the murders. Google provided the data, and investigators filtered it down to addresses within close proximity to the crime scene, working on the theory that someone surveilling the family on foot probably lived nearby. That narrowed the field considerably. Then they turned to mobile phone data, and this is where the approach became genuinely clever. On December 21st, roughly 30,000 phone numbers had logged connections to cell towers in the Rupperswil area, everyone in the neighborhood plus anyone driving through. But investigators weren't just looking at who was there that day. They wanted to know which phones had been registering near Carla's house consistently in the days and weeks before, and which of those phones had suddenly gone silent on December 21st itself. But if that same person was smart enough to leave their phone at home on the day they committed the crime, or switched it off before leaving the house, their number would simply vanish from the data on that one specific morning. And that absence, that gap where a pattern suddenly stops, is itself a form of evidence. That is exactly what investigators found. One number had been registering near Carla's street every single morning, consistently, over an extended period of time. And on December 21st, 2015, the day 4 people were murdered, it was completely gone. The number was registered to a 33-year-old man who lived less than 500 meters from the crime scene. Knowing who the suspect probably was and actually being able to prove it were two entirely different problems. Investigators couldn't simply knock on his door and ask for a DNA swab. The moment he knew he was a suspect, he could run, destroy evidence, or get a lawyer and go silent before there was any chance of building a solid case. They needed his DNA without him ever realizing what was happening, and they needed to get it in a way that would hold up legally. So they came up with a plan. Officers set up what looked like a completely routine roadside sobriety checkpoint in the neighborhood, the kind of standard traffic stop that happens regularly across Switzerland and raises no suspicion whatsoever. When the man drove through, which was entirely predictable given that he lived just down the road, officers flagged him down calmly and asked him to breathe into a breathalyzer. He did, without any fuss. The device collected his DNA. It was sent to the lab and compared against the profile recovered from the crime scene, and it was a match. On May 12, 2016, nearly 5 months after the murders, the man was arrested at his home. On that same day, he confessed. His name, as it appeared in Swiss and international media at the time of his trial, was Thomas N. Swiss. Media conventions around naming defendants differ from what you might be used to elsewhere. Full surnames aren't always published. But his identity is part of the public court record, and the case is well documented internationally. He was 33 years old, Swiss-born, unmarried, and had absolutely no criminal record. Not a speeding ticket. Not a single prior interaction with law enforcement of any kind. He still lived with his mother in the house where he had grown up. His father had passed away just a few months before the murders. By every outward measure, Thomas N. appeared to lead the most completely ordinary life you could imagine. He'd gotten his high school diploma and started university but dropped out, enrolled in a different program in a completely different field, and dropped out again. Over the years, he tried 5 different courses of study, never sticking with any of them for long, and had no stable career to show for it. But he had hobbies that kept him visible and social. He had coached a junior football team in the region for years, and had taken on real leadership roles in several local clubs. He had 2 husky dogs that he absolutely adored, walking them every single day, taking endless photographs of them, posting the pictures on social media. People who knew him through those activities described him the same way every time: quiet, calm, and completely normal. The one detail anyone could point to that set him slightly apart was that he had no close friends and had never been in a romantic relationship. That was it. That was the only thing. On the day of his arrest, Thomas N. gave a full confession and explained in detail how everything had started. A few months before December 2015, he had crossed paths with Davin, Carla's 13-year-old son, near his school. He became fixated on the boy. From that point on, he began deliberately routing his daily dog walks along the path Davin took to school each morning, using the dogs as natural cover so that he looked like just another neighbor out for a stroll. He did this regularly, learning the family's routine, identifying the window of time each morning when Georg would have left for work and the house would be accessible. Over time, just watching wasn't enough anymore, and he began to plan in earnest. He designed and printed fake business cards. He wrote a fake official letter on convincing-looking stationery. He assembled a backpack, cable ties, duct tape, a knife, and kept it ready. He identified exactly when to act. None of this was impulsive or accidental. It was weeks of careful, deliberate preparation, and every single detail was considered. In his confession, and later at trial, Thomas N. was clear about his central motivation. It was about power and control. The money was never really the point. Demanding the bank withdrawal was simply a mechanism to keep Carla cooperative and buy himself uninterrupted time inside the house. After the murders, he washed himself in the family's bathroom to remove trace evidence, poured fire starter across the bodies and throughout the rooms, set the house alight, and walked out. He went less than 500 meters back to his own front door. That same afternoon, he met friends at a restaurant. That evening, he went to a casino and paid with the banknotes Carla had handed him that morning. 2 days later, on December 23rd, he posted Christmas greetings on Facebook, photos of his dogs in the winter light, warm holiday wishes for everyone he knew. When police searched his home after his arrest, they found something that made clear just how close a second attack had been. Thomas N. had already identified new targets. He had their names, their details, and their addresses written down, and his backpack, the same one he had carried to Carla's door, was already packed and ready to go. He told investigators plainly that he had intended to do this again. Thomas N.'s trial took place in March 2018, roughly 2.5 years after the murders. Psychiatric experts evaluated him thoroughly throughout the proceedings, and their conclusion was unambiguous. He was fully mentally competent at the time of the crimes. There was no psychosis, no condition that had clouded his judgment or reduced his legal responsibility in any way. He had understood exactly what he was doing, he had planned it carefully, and he had carried it out step by step. The court found him guilty on all charges and sentenced him to life imprisonment, the most serious penalty available under Swiss law. It's worth explaining briefly how that works in Switzerland, because it's a little different from other countries. Life sentences there are not automatically permanent and do come with a mechanism for review. However, for offenders who are assessed as posing a continuing danger to the public, courts can impose an additional designation called indefinite incapacitation, which very significantly limits any future prospect of release, given the deliberateness of the planning, the nature of the crimes, and Thomas N.'s own stated intention to reoffend. This case was treated with the full weight of the Swiss judicial system. His arrest and the details that came out at trial shook Switzerland deeply. The country simply isn't accustomed to crimes of this scale, this coldness, or this level of calculated violence against an ordinary family in a safe, quiet neighborhood. For many Swiss people, Rupperswil became one of those before and after moments in the national consciousness, a date that changed how people thought about safety in their own communities. In 2018, the same year the verdict came down, Carla's partner, Georg, published a book. Its title, translated from German, is Forever: The Inconceivable Act of Rupperswil and Its Consequences. He wrote it as an attempt to make sense of something that resists making sense, to document what December 21st felt like in real time, what the months and years afterward actually looked like, and what it means to try to survive a grief with no clean edges, to lose your partner, her sons, and a young woman you knew, all in a single morning while you were at work, to arrive home to a police cordon, to be questioned as a suspect, and to be told in the back of a patrol car that the people you loved were gone. The book was received with deep compassion across Switzerland, and his willingness to put his name to something so painful gave the case a human face that media coverage, focused as it so often was on the perpetrator and the investigation, sometimes failed to provide. Because here is what matters most at the end of this story. Carla was 48 years old, a mother who walked calmly into a terrifying situation because she believed that doing so would keep her children alive. She was wrong, but the love behind that decision was absolute. Dion was 19, with his whole adult life ahead of him. He was in love, and he had a future. Davin was 13, a kid who walked to school in the mornings and played football with his friends and had done absolutely nothing wrong. And Simona was 21, spontaneously staying over at her boyfriend's place on a perfectly ordinary Sunday evening, the way any of us might without a second thought. These 4 people are the center of this story, not the man who took their lives. What stays with me about this case, what I keep coming back to, is the investigation itself, and specifically the creativity it required to get there. Think about where police started. A crime scene deliberately destroyed by fire, no witnesses, no known motive, a perpetrator with no criminal record and no prior connection to the victims, and a DNA profile that matched nothing in any database. 40 investigators working around the clock for months, and for a long time, getting nowhere. The case very nearly went cold, and then the break, when it came, didn't look like anything you'd expect. It wasn't a witness coming forward or a tip line call or a surveillance camera. It was the absence of a phone signal, the fact that a device had been registering near that street every single morning and then simply wasn't there on the one morning that counted most. That gap in the data, that negative space where a pattern suddenly stops, turned out to be the thread that unraveled everything. Add to that the decision to collect the suspect's DNA through a fake sobriety stop rather than alerting him prematurely, and the coordination between forensic specialists, telecom data analysts, and officers on the ground. And what you have is an investigation that, despite enormous obstacles, refused to give up. It took 5 months, but it worked, and 4 people who deserved justice got it. If this case has stayed with you, if you're thinking about Carla and her sons, about Simona, about Georg sitting in the back of that police car on a December afternoon being told his family was gone, that's exactly the right response. Let it stay.